The day after I buried my husband of 46 years, my daughter-in-law threw a $750,000 loan file onto my coffee table and told me I could either pay my son's debt or stop calling myself family. She said it while the flowers from my husband's funeral were still dying in vases around the living room. She said it while I was still wearing the same black sweater I'd worn to the cemetery. She said it without a hint of hesitation. My son stood behind her with his hands in his pockets and never once told her to stop. I looked at both of them for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered. Are you both absolutely sure this is the decision you want to make? Vanessa laughed. You have no choice anymore. I smiled, not because I found anything funny, because neither of them had the faintest idea where they were sitting, or who actually owned it. By sunset, everything they believed belonged to them would begin slipping through their fingers. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Margaret. I'm 73 years old. Until 2 days ago, I was married to the only man I'd ever loved. His name was Robert. Cancer doesn't care how long you've been married. It doesn't care about promises made at 22, or grandchildren, or retirement plans, or the tomatoes someone planted because they expected another summer together. It simply arrives, takes everything one piece at a time, and leaves behind a house that suddenly sounds far too quiet. The funeral had been beautiful. That's what everyone kept telling me. The service was beautiful. The flowers were beautiful. The pastor's message was beautiful. I thanked them all, because that's what widows are expected to do. Smile politely. Accept casseroles. Pretend they're listening. The truth was, I remembered almost nothing after the final hymn. I remembered dirt striking the top of Robert's casket. I remembered Ethan putting a hand on my shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. I remembered Vanessa checking her phone while people hugged me. After that, everything blurred together. The house still smelled like lilies. Someone from church had brought enough food to feed 20 people. Half the refrigerator was filled with foil-covered dishes that neither Robert nor I would ever eat. His reading glasses were still sitting beside his favorite chair. His slippers were tucked neatly underneath it. His coffee mug was in the dishwasher, because I'd washed it the morning after he died, before realizing no one would ever use it again. Grief does strange things. Sometimes it makes you cry, because you find your husband's jacket hanging by the door. Sometimes it makes you stand in the laundry room for 10 minutes trying to remember why you walked in there. And sometimes it makes you notice the smallest sounds with unbearable clarity: the grandfather clock, the refrigerator humming, the floorboards settling. Every noise reminded me that one voice was missing. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, I heard tires crunch across the gravel driveway. I assumed it was another neighbor, another church friend, someone bringing pie I would never finish. Instead, I looked through the front window and saw Ethan's SUV. I smiled despite myself. Maybe he'd come back, because yesterday had been overwhelming. Maybe he wanted to sit with me. Maybe he wanted to talk about his father. I opened the front door before they reached the porch. "Hi, sweetheart." Ethan looked exhausted. His eyes were red. He'd always looked like Robert. Same broad shoulders, same dark hair before gray started creeping in. Same habit of rubbing the back of his neck when something bothered him. For one hopeful second, I saw the little boy who used to climb into our bed after thunderstorms. Then Vanessa stepped past him. She carried a thick black file tucked under one arm. No flowers, no hug, no. "How are you holding up?" She walked into my living room like someone arriving for a business meeting. I closed the door slowly behind them. "Can I make some coffee?" "No," she answered. "We won't be staying long." Something inside me tightened. Not fear, recognition. Some conversations announce themselves before the first difficult word is spoken. Vanessa sat on the couch. Ethan remained standing. I noticed he hadn't taken off his coat. Vanessa placed the file on the coffee table. Carefully, deliberately. She looked around the room for a second. "This place is bigger than I remembered." I nodded. "We haven't changed much." "No." Her eyes drifted toward the staircase. Still in good shape. There was something strangely evaluative about the way she looked at everything. Like she wasn't visiting. Like she was taking inventory. I sat in Robert's chair. It still felt wrong to be the only one in the room using it. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Vanessa pushed the file toward me. $750,000. I looked at it without touching it. I'm sorry? Your son's debt. She folded her hands together. You pay it, or don't ever call us family again. The room became impossibly still. Even the clock seemed quieter. I looked at Ethan. He stared at the carpet. Ethan? He swallowed. It's complicated. Vanessa answered for him. No, it isn't. She tapped the file. The business loans. Business. Robert had mentioned Ethan's company wasn't doing well. He never told me numbers. Only that things were tight. I looked back at Vanessa. I didn't know it had reached this point. Of course you didn't. Her tone wasn't angry. It was almost dismissive. Ethan didn't want to worry you. I see. She leaned forward. The banks aren't interested in excuses anymore. I rested my hands in my lap. What exactly are you asking? We're asking you to protect your son. I waited. She seemed annoyed that I wasn't interrupting. The debt has to be covered. $750,000. Yes. And you believe I have that kind of money? She shrugged. This house is worth plenty. There it was. The first assumption. Not about me. About the house. I glanced toward the hallway where Robert's photograph hung on the wall. He was smiling in it. Fishing trip. Lake Erie. 20 years ago. I've buried my husband, I said quietly. Yesterday. Vanessa's expression softened for perhaps half a second. I know. Do you? She looked away. We're grieving too. I don't doubt that. She exhaled. But this can't wait. The words echoed around the room. This can't wait. Apparently neither could discussing my finances before the sympathy cards had all arrived. I turned to Ethan again. Is this what you want? His lips parted. Nothing came out. Vanessa answered instead. We've discussed it. I noticed she kept saying we. Never, Ethan, never. Always we. As though speaking for both of them had become second nature. I looked directly at my son. I'm asking you. He finally raised his eyes. We're out of options. Those 4 words hurt more than Vanessa's entire speech. Not because they were cruel. Because they were hopeless. I remembered Ethan at 12 years old, trying to fix his bicycle with a screwdriver that was far too small. I'll figure it out, he'd insisted. At 16, after failing his driver's test the first time. I'll get it next week. At 25, after being laid off. I'll find something. He'd always believed there was another answer somewhere. Now he stood in my living room looking like a man who had run out of answers. Vanessa opened the file. The pages were covered with tabs, highlighted numbers, bank logos, legal language. She slid the first document across the table. You don't have to read everything. I wasn't planning to. The amount is on the first page. I still didn't touch it. Instead I asked, how long have you known? Neither of them answered immediately. Vanessa. She hesitated. Several months. And you waited until the day after Robert's funeral. She crossed her arms. We waited until there was no other choice. The sentence settled heavily between us. I thought back over the last 6 months. Sunday dinners, birthdays, Christmas, the afternoons Ethan stopped by to help Robert trim hedges, the smiles, the ordinary conversations, all while this sat quietly in the background. How many times had they looked around this house, calculating its value without my knowing? The thought was colder than anger. It was sadness. You should have told us, I said. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Dad would have worried? He was your father. He was dying. I couldn't argue with that. Robert had spent his last months fighting to breathe. Perhaps Ethan had wanted to spare him. Perhaps he'd wanted to spare me too. But somehow we'd arrived here anyway. Vanessa leaned closer. We're not asking for charity. I looked at her. No. This is about family. I almost smiled. People often reach for that word when they're asking someone else to make an impossible sacrifice. Family. She nodded. You have the resources. Resources. Not memories. Not home. Resources. She gestured around the room. This house alone. I raised one hand gently. She stopped talking. The room fell silent again. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A bird landed briefly on the porch railing, before flying away. Life continued as though nothing remarkable was happening. Inside, my only child sat across from me, waiting to see whether I'd surrender everything he believed I possessed. I studied both of their faces. Vanessa looked determined. Frightened beneath the determination, but determined all the same. Ethan looked exhausted, ashamed, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I understood desperation. I'd lived long enough to know it could make decent people justify terrible decisions. Still, some lines remain lines. Finally, I folded my hands together. Are you both absolutely sure this is the decision you want to make? Vanessa let out a short laugh. You have no choice anymore. I held her gaze. Then I smiled, not triumphantly, not mockingly, simply with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing something everyone else in the room has completely overlooked. For the first time since they'd arrived, that smile seemed to unsettle her. She frowned. What? I didn't answer. Instead, I looked toward the front window where the late afternoon sun stretched across the yard Robert had spent decades tending with patient hands. The maple tree, the white fence, the porch swing he'd built himself, everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Yet somehow, the room had changed. Vanessa followed my gaze. What are you looking at? I turned back to them. Nothing. She narrowed her eyes. I don't think that's true. I reached over, closed the loan file without reading a single page, and gently pushed it back across the coffee table. Neither of them noticed the small envelope resting beneath yesterday's stack of condolence cards. Neither of them asked why it had already been opened. And neither of them realized that before the sun disappeared behind the maple tree, someone else would be knocking on that very same front door. The doorbell rang. Not a timid, uncertain ring, one clear press. Then, silence. Vanessa glanced toward the front door. Were you expecting someone? I looked at the clock on the mantel. No. That wasn't entirely true. I had been expecting someone. I just hadn't known the exact minute. Ethan shifted his weight for the first time since they'd arrived. I can get it. You don't have to, I said, standing carefully. My knees reminded me I wasn't 30 anymore. Grief had settled into my body like an extra weight. Every movement took just a little more effort than it had a week ago. As I crossed the living room, I could feel both of them watching me. Not because I was walking slowly, because I wasn't panicking. If anything, I seemed calmer than when they'd first arrived. I opened the front door. A man in a charcoal suit stood on the porch, holding a slim leather portfolio. He looked to be in his late 50s. Neatly trimmed gray beard, wire-rimmed glasses, professional without looking intimidating. When he saw me, his expression softened. Mrs. Whitmore? Yes? My condolences. Thank you. He lowered his voice. I'm sorry to come by today. It's all right. He glanced past my shoulder toward the living room. I hope I'm not interrupting. You've arrived at an interesting moment. A faint smile crossed his face. I suspected that might be the case. Before either of us could say another word, Vanessa appeared a few steps behind me. Who is it? The man politely nodded toward her. Good afternoon. She waited. So? He looked back at me. I can come back if this isn't convenient. I thought for a moment, then stepped aside. No. Please come in. He thanked me quietly before entering the house. Vanessa folded her arms. And you are? My name is Daniel Harper. He extended a hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she looked at me. You know him? Yes. Not well. But well enough. Daniel had first walked into our lives months earlier, long before Robert's funeral, back when the future still felt like something my husband and I were planning together. I hadn't expected to think about those afternoons today. Yet seeing him standing in my foyer pulled me right back. Robert had been sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm weather. Cancer had made him cold all the time. He held a mug of coffee with both hands, even though he'd barely taken a sip. You've been staring at those tomatoes for 20 minutes, I'd teased. They're finally coming in. You've said that every morning this week. He smiled. I like watching things grow." There was a long silence. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "If something happens to me—" I interrupted immediately. "Don't, no." He shook his head gently. "We need to. We have time." He looked at me with tired eyes. "I don't think we do." That afternoon was the first time we talked seriously about everything we'd spent decades assuming we'd figure out later. The house, savings, insurance, paperwork, all the things couples postpone because discussing them feels like inviting tragedy inside. A week later, Daniel Harper had come to the house. He'd sat exactly where Vanessa was sitting now. Robert had insisted on making coffee himself, even though carrying 2 mugs from the kitchen exhausted him. "We're just making sure Margaret won't have unnecessary headaches later." That's what Robert had said. Nothing more, nothing less. I never asked Daniel many questions. Robert handled most of that conversation. When Daniel finally left, Robert squeezed my hand. "I feel better." "About what?" "Knowing things are in order." I kissed his forehead. "So do I." "Mrs. Whitmore?" Daniel's voice brought me back. I realized everyone in the room was looking at me. "I'm sorry. I asked if you'd still like to meet today." "I would." Vanessa frowned. "Meet about what?" Daniel looked toward me instead of answering her. "I'll follow your lead." She looked between us. "What does that mean?" I walked back toward the living room. "It means this conversation doesn't concern everyone." Vanessa gave a short laugh. "I think it does." "No." I remained calm. "It really doesn't." Her expression hardened. "We're discussing $750,000. "I know. So whatever this is can wait." Daniel spoke for the first time since entering. "I'm afraid it can't." His tone was courteous, firm, professional. Vanessa looked irritated. "And why exactly not?" "I'm here because Mrs. Whitmore requested that I come this afternoon." "I've never heard of you." "I wouldn't expect you to." She looked at Ethan. He only shrugged. "I don't know him either." Daniel nodded once. "That's correct." The room settled into another uneasy silence. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that Vanessa no longer seemed completely certain she controlled the conversation. She disliked that feeling. People who rely on certainty usually do. She looked back at me. "Margaret." Why, it was the first time she'd used my name all afternoon. "We need to finish what we came here to discuss." "We will." "When?" "When everyone is ready to listen." Her brow furrowed. What is that supposed to mean? I looked toward Ethan. "How long have you known about the debt?" He hesitated. "Almost 8 months." "And your father?" His eyes filled immediately. "He never knew the number." "So, you did keep it from him?" He looked down. "I couldn't." His voice caught. "I couldn't put that on him." For the first time since they'd arrived, I saw not a grown man drowning in financial trouble, but the frightened little boy who used to stand outside the principal's office, trying to decide whether to tell me he'd gotten into trouble before or after we got home. He'd always hated disappointing people. Vanessa reached over and squeezed his arm. "We did what we thought was best." I believed she believed that. Desperation has a way of shrinking a person's world until only one outcome seems acceptable. It doesn't excuse everything, but it explains more than people like to admit. Daniel remained quietly near the entryway. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't uncomfortable. He simply waited. Eventually Vanessa looked at him again. "I still don't understand why you're here." He smiled politely. "I understand." "Then explain it." "I'm not able to do that." "Why not?" "Because Mrs. Whitmore hasn't asked me to." She stared at him in disbelief. "So you're just going to stand there?" "If that's what she prefers." I almost smiled. Robert had once described Daniel as the calmest man I've ever met. He'd been right. Nothing seemed capable of rushing him. Not even this. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften. Long shadows stretched across the front yard. The maple tree Robert loved so much moved gently in the breeze. I remembered the year we'd planted it. Ethan had been 9. He insisted on helping. He'd shoveled exactly 3 scoops of dirt before announcing he was tired. Robert laughed and finished the job while Ethan chased lightning bugs across the lawn. "You'll appreciate this tree someday," Robert had called after him. At the time, Ethan rolled his eyes. Years later, every family photograph seemed to happen beneath those branches. Birthday parties, graduation pictures, Christmas mornings when there wasn't any snow, life quietly growing around something we'd planted together. I wondered if Ethan remembered any of that while he sat across from me now. He caught me looking at him. "What?" "I was just remembering." His face softened. "Dad, yes. I miss him." "I know." His voice broke. "I really do." "I know." Vanessa looked at him with genuine concern. She rubbed his back gently. For just a moment, the businesslike confidence disappeared, replaced by a wife watching her husband grieve his father. That moment mattered, because it reminded me she wasn't heartless. She was terrified. Fear simply wears different faces on different people. Sometimes it looks like tears. Sometimes it looks like demands. Daniel glanced discreetly at his watch before looking back at me. No pressure, just a silent reminder. The timing we discussed was approaching. Vanessa noticed the glance. "What time is it?" "A little after 4, Daniel answered. She frowned. "Why does the time matter?" No one answered. Her eyes narrowed. "What aren't you telling us?" I folded my hands together. "Nothing you won't learn soon enough." She stood. "I'm tired of riddles." "So am I." "Then just say it." I met her gaze. "I will." She waited. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Instead of speaking, I turned toward the front window. A second vehicle had just entered the driveway. Its tires crunched slowly over the gravel before coming to a stop beside Ethan's SUV. Daniel looked out the window too. Then, very quietly, he said, "Right on time." Vanessa followed our eyes, and the color drained from her face as another unfamiliar figure stepped out of the car carrying a hard-sided briefcase. The woman closed the car door, adjusted the strap of the hard-sided briefcase, and walked steadily toward the front porch. Nobody in the room spoke. Vanessa looked at me. "Who is that?" I answered honestly. "Someone the first asked to come." The woman reached the front door just as Daniel stepped forward and opened it before she could knock. "Good afternoon," he said. She smiled politely. "Am I on time?" "Exactly." She entered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She appeared to be around my age, perhaps a few years younger, wearing a navy suit without a single wrinkle. She carried herself like someone who had spent decades explaining complicated things to frightened people. "I'm Linda Foster," she said, looking first at me before acknowledging the others. "Mrs. Whitmore. It's good to see you again." She offered a sympathetic smile. "I wish it were under different circumstances." "So do I." Vanessa finally interrupted. "Can someone please tell us what's going on?" Linda looked toward me. "Would you like me to?" I nodded. "Please." She set the briefcase on the dining room table instead of the coffee table, opened the latches, and removed a neatly organized folder. "I understand there has been some confusion regarding this property." Vanessa gave a short, nervous laugh. "I don't think there's any confusion." Linda didn't react. "I'm afraid there is." She slid one document onto the table but kept a hand resting over it. "This home was never part of Robert Whitmore's estate." Silence. Ethan frowned. "What?" Linda looked directly at him. "It could not become part of your father's estate because he did not own it." He stared at her. "That's impossible." "It isn't." Vanessa looked at me. "You let us believe." "I let you believe exactly what you assumed." Linda continued calmly. "The property has been solely owned by Margaret Whitmore for many years." Ethan blinked several times. "No." "I'm afraid that's correct." He looked around the room as if expecting someone else to disagree. "Dad bought this house." I finally spoke. "No." His eyes snapped toward me. "We chose it together." I smiled sadly. "There's a difference." I rested my hand on the arm of Robert's chair. "When we were first married, your father wanted to buy this house. We couldn't qualify together because money was tight." Ethan listened without interrupting. "My parents helped me, not him. They loaned me money with one condition." I could almost hear my father's voice again. Margaret, he told me, kindness is wonderful, but every woman deserves one thing in this world that nobody can take away from her. I hadn't fully understood him at 27. Robert had. He insisted, I said quietly, that the house remain in my name alone. Ethan looked stunned. Dad? Agree to that? I laughed softly through tears. It was his idea. Linda nodded. I have copies of the original closing documents, the recorded deed, and every subsequent refinance. Ownership never changed. Vanessa's shoulders slowly sagged. She looked at the living room differently now, not as something slipping away, as something that had never been within reach. I continued. Your father used to joke that he paid every electric bill for 46 years while living in his wife's house. A small smile escaped me. He loved saying it because he knew exactly why it mattered. Ethan whispered, he never told me. No. Why? Because he never wanted you to think ownership determined who loved this family. Linda quietly closed the folder. There is another misunderstanding. Vanessa looked up. What now? You mentioned yesterday that Mrs. Whitmore had no choice. Yes. She has every choice. The room was still. The property cannot be pledged for your debt without her voluntary consent. Vanessa closed her eyes. She couldn't finish. For the first time since she'd arrived the day before, every ounce of certainty had disappeared. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked frightened, not of me, of what she'd become. Ethan sank onto the couch and covered his face with both hands. I'm so sorry. No one answered immediately. Finally, he looked up at me. I failed. I shook my head. No. I brought this into your house the day after Dad's funeral. Yes. I let her. His voice cracked. No. I stopped him gently. Don't put all of this on Vanessa. He looked surprised. She pushed. She did. But you were drowning. He lowered his head again. I should have protected you. You should have talked to me. He nodded slowly. I know. Vanessa finally found her voice. I've been terrified for months. No one interrupted. I kept thinking if we could just solve the debt. She wiped at her eyes. Everything else would be okay. She looked at me. I stopped seeing people. I waited. I only saw problems. The room stayed quiet. She took a shaky breath. When I walked in here yesterday, I wasn't thinking about your funeral. I know. I wasn't thinking about Robert. I know. I was only thinking about surviving. Tears rolled freely down her face now. I'm ashamed of that. I believed her, not because the words were dramatic, because they were difficult. Real remorse usually is. Daniel spoke for the first time in several minutes. Sometimes fear convinces decent people that desperation excuses entitlement. Vanessa nodded without looking up. I think that's exactly what happened. Ethan stood and walked to the window. His father's maple tree swayed gently outside. I don't even know how to fix this. I stood beside him. You don't fix yesterday. He looked at me. You change tomorrow. He cried then. Not loudly. Just the quiet tears of a son who had buried his father and nearly lost his mother in the same week without realizing it. I wrapped my arms around him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally he whispered, I thought Dad would have wanted me to fight for the family. He would have. I chose the wrong battle. Yes. A week later, the loan file was gone. Not because I paid it, because Ethan and Vanessa took it back with them. They met with their lenders, sold the business equipment that wasn't essential, closed the failing location they'd been desperately trying to save, moved into a much smaller rental apartment. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was theirs. Months later, Vanessa came to my house alone, carrying a small apple pie. No files, no demands. She stood awkwardly on the porch. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I almost didn't. She nodded. I would have understood. I invited her inside anyway. She looked around the living room. I don't think I ever really saw this house before. What do you mean? I only saw what it could do for us. She smiled sadly. Now I just see your home. That mattered more than any apology. The following spring, Ethan came over with a shovel. "What are we planting?" I asked. He smiled. "A maple." "You already have one." "I know." He looked toward his father's tree. "This one's for Mom." We planted it together in the far corner of the yard. When we finished, he leaned on the shovel and laughed quietly. Dad would have said I still don't know how to dig a proper hole. He absolutely would have. For the first time since the funeral, the laughter didn't hurt. It healed. Sometimes people ask me if I ever considered paying the debt. The honest answer is yes. For a few moments, I did. Not because I was afraid of losing the house, but because I loved my son. Then I remembered something Robert once told me while we were sitting on the porch watching that old maple tree grow. If we spend our lives rescuing people from the consequences of every desperate decision, they'll never learn that the strongest families aren't built on what they can take from each other. They're built on what they choose to protect. That house was never the lesson. It was simply the place where all of us finally learned one. A few weeks after we planted the maple, Daniel stopped by one last time. He wasn't carrying a portfolio this time. Just a small envelope. "I figured you'd rather have these than leave them in a file cabinet." I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared thousands of ordinary mornings. Daniel slid the envelope across to me. Inside were copies of the documents we'd discussed but never really looked at after signing them years ago. The original deed. The recorded transfer. The trust paperwork Robert and I had completed during his illness. I ran my fingers over Robert's signature. Strong. Steady. Exactly the way he'd always written his name. Daniel smiled. He insisted on one thing during every meeting. I looked up. What was that? He wanted every document written as clearly as possible. I laughed softly. That sounds like him. He kept saying, "If Margaret ever has to read this without me, I don't want her needing a translator." I had to blink away tears. That was Robert. Always thinking one step ahead. Always trying to make tomorrow a little easier for someone else. Daniel pointed to one page. "The house remains solely yours because that's how it had been titled from the beginning. When your parents helped with the down payment, they wanted to make sure you always had security in your own name." I nodded. "My father called it my anchor." "He did?" "Robert never once asked me to change it." Daniel smiled. He was actually the one who insisted we leave it exactly as it was. I looked back down at the papers. For years, I'd thought of them as legal documents. Now they felt more like love letters, written in the language of deeds and signatures. Robert hadn't protected a piece of property. He had protected my independence. When Daniel left, I placed the envelope in the same drawer where Robert used to keep our passports and warranty cards. Not because I expected to need it again, because it belonged with the rest of our life. A month later, Ethan called. "Mom?" "Hi, sweetheart. I've got something to ask." "Go ahead." "Can I come over Saturday?" "Of course." "Not because I need anything." "I know. I just want to spend some time with you." "Then come." He arrived alone. No paperwork. No tension. He brought sandwiches from the little deli Robert loved. We ate on the back porch. For almost an hour we talked about everything except money. Then he finally said, "I've been going to counseling." I looked at him. I didn't know. I kept thinking about how quickly I stopped seeing you as my mom and started seeing you as a solution. He stared out at the yard. "That scares me." "It should. I don't ever want to become that person again." "You don't have to." He nodded. "I'm learning that asking for help isn't the same as deciding what someone else owes you." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's a lesson some people never learn." He smiled. I almost didn't. A few days before Christmas, Vanessa asked if she could stop by. When I opened the door, she handed me a small wrapped package. "I know this doesn't fix anything." "No. But I wanted you to have it." Inside was a new picture frame. She had taken one of my favorite old photographs of Robert standing beneath the maple tree, with a much younger Ethan on his shoulders, and had it professionally restored. The colors were vibrant again. The cracks were gone. I traced Robert's smile with my fingertip. "It's beautiful." She looked relieved. I found it in one of the albums Ethan borrowed. We stood quietly for a moment. Then she said something I never expected. I used to think security came from owning things. She looked around the living room. Now I think it comes from knowing the people you love still want you around after you've hurt them. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't something that arrives all at once. It grows. Much like the maple outside. I can't pretend none of it happened, I finally said. I'm not asking you to. But I don't want one terrible week to define the rest of our lives. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't either. The following spring, the grandchildren came over to help me plant flowers. Emma carefully patted soil around the petunias. Grandma? Yes? Mom says we always ask before we touch things that belong to someone else. I smiled. That's a very good rule. She nodded seriously. She says, even if they love you. I looked toward the porch where Vanessa was helping Noah untangle the garden hose. She caught my eye. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. Some apologies are spoken only once. The rest are lived. As for the house, I still wake up every morning to the same creaky floorboards, the same kitchen window over the sink, and the same maple tree Robert planted all those years ago. People sometimes assume the story was about who owned the house. It wasn't. The deed answered that question long before any of us walked into the living room that afternoon. The real question was whether grief, fear, and desperation would permanently cost me my son. For a while, I thought they had. I'm grateful I was wrong. The house gave me shelter. The documents gave me clarity. But time, honest conversations, and people willing to admit they had failed each other. That was what finally gave us another chance to become a family again. Robert used to say that a home isn't the walls that protect the people inside. It's the people who decide they're still worth protecting after everything falls apart. Years later, every time I sit on the porch beneath the shade of those two maple trees, the old one Robert planted with a little boy beside him, and the new one Ethan planted beside me, I think about how close we came to losing far more than a house. And every time my family gathers around my table now, no one assumes. They ask. It turns out that simple difference changed everything.